This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
All right, welcome back to Transparency, everyone. This week, we're happy to be joined by Addison, who I've been following on Twitter for a little while. Addison, you're a trans guy, and I know that we share some similar views, but you're also a psychology major. And one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on today was some of the things that you've been saying on Twitter. And he said, you feel like you're at a point where you feel ready to speak out about some things and share some of your concerns. So welcome to Transparency.
Thank you. I appreciate the honor of being on.
It's great to get to know you. I'd love to hear just a little bit about what your story has been with gender dysphoria and your transition.
Yeah. I feel like, it used to be the majority of cases, but it seems like the minority now that I'm pretty much the cookie cutter case of like, I've known forever that, I was supposed to be, male, and, that's just how I always viewed myself. I tried to convince others, the same kind of thing. I've always had that distress since I think the earliest I can maybe picture is maybe like 3 or 4 that I actually verbally expressed this, distress or this identity, I guess, or, however you want to word that. But yeah, I've pretty much been standard. Like I didn't have necessarily like a transition because I've always just kind of dressed this way and acted this way. And, the only thing is one day I, asked to be called a different name, and, everything else kind of just flowed with it. My parents weren't exactly like surprised or anything. So it's, I transitioned when I was maybe like if medically a 19, started hormones at 19. I had surgery at 20, and again this year at 27. I think I changed my name about, I was maybe like 11 or 12. So when I started officially, you could call it a social transition, even though I didn't change anything visually or anything. But yeah, I feel pretty standard. I didn't find out and when I was 40 or anything, so that's the base of my story, the skeleton of it.
Do your parents remember you as a young kid of being really, really gender nonconforming? Was that really obvious to them?
Yeah. I think I was trying to cut my hair at about 4 or 5. I had a really terrible bowl cut for a long time because they wouldn't let me have a short hair. Yeah, I've always dressed masculinely. I would refuse to put on the girls' clothes, and my mom, looking back, she says that she thought I was just gonna be a lesbian or something, which she was okay with. She's very open-minded, but my dad, very closed-minded to that, very throughout my childhood would be very critical of assuming that I was going to be a lesbian, even though I've insisted that that wasn't true, which I think is just kind of confusing for a lot of my family. But they're pretty accepting for the most part.
You sort of almost did a social transition when you were quite young, preteen age. Was that something that you did at school? Were you kind of existed as one of the boys, or was it more just a name and aesthetic thing? How did that work functionally?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think that the boys really cared. I think I remember playing with them, and about preschool, we would chase the girls around, and they didn't question it at all. I don't think that the boys really paid attention to that until maybe about middle school. Then they started getting weird about me playing with them, or I don't know, being around them. And I kind of I was super social as a child. I had a lot of friends, and they're all boys. You know, I'd go to their sleepovers and their birthday parties, and you know, we'd hang out outside of school and in school, played Pokemon and all that stuff. And I think in middle school is when I started to kind of feel that like being kind of ostracized for looking this way. And, you know, that's about the time that I tried using a new name. And I think probably about puberty is when they kind of took a step away. But previous to that, nobody really cared. You know, there was some bullying, but they're not my friends.
How did you make sense of that experience when you were younger?
I tried to, I don't know, I didn't really think about it like in depth. I just was very insistent that I was a boy no matter what. I tried to convince others that I was. Honestly, I'm glad no one called like CPS or something, because I would go around telling people that when I was a baby, like that my boy privates were cut off or something, you know, try to convince people. I'm glad no like adults overheard that, because that'd be concerning. But yeah, I just, I didn't think about it too hard. I just knew that, you know, like I'm a boy. I was very in denial that I would ever go through like a, you know, female puberty. Like I think when I was like 8, you know, my mom told me, all right, you're gonna have to start wearing a shirt, you know, soon. And I was just like, I remember standing in the mirror like, what are you talking about? Like, you know, just looking at myself, be like, no, that's not gonna happen to me. And you know, I kind of pushed it away and kind of like denied that I was anything other than like the other males. Obviously puberty kind of was a little bit of a slap in the face in that regard, but that's about how I made sense of it until I think puberty. Middle school, I was put in therapy, and the therapist, you know, she was like, oh, well, how do you feel about when people like call you a girl? And I was like, oh, I don't like that. And you know, especially when people tell other people that I'm a girl and all that. She was like, oh, it's called outing. And I was like, no, that's for like gay people, or that's not me. And you know, that's kind of when I started to think about like what words might be used to describe me and how other people might have this same kind of experience. And I just like, it took me a while to like accept that I was part of like some other group. I just kind of like, you know, try to see myself as just a boy. Like that's just how it's kind of always been to me.
Is that how the other kids responded to you? I mean, I know you said some of them bullied you, but did...
Yeah, for the most part, they're pretty accepting that, you know, there was an occasional like um kid who you know, wasn't friends with, who would be like, oh, you're a girl. And I just be like, no, I'm just a boy with long hair. And or like people on the outside would, you know, I think maybe I was been about kindergarten, like people called me like a lesbian, and I didn't know what that meant, you know. So I was like, no, you're a lesbian, like to these boys. You know, as kids, you're like, no, you are. Yeah. So like, I don't know. I feel like at least my friends who'd play Pokemon and, you know, go run around the jungle gym, like they didn't think anything of it. They didn't like make a deal of it. It was more the, you know, maybe like the older kids, I guess, would probably be the ones that were yelling at me. And, you know, towards puberty, it definitely got a little worse, you know, when I experienced the, you know, like homophobia parts of it. You know, when they assumed that I was like, you know, a butch lesbian or something, like definitely experienced some hate in that regard. Um, you know, until I switched schools through high school and went completely like stealth. Like my mom got my name and gender marker changed at the school before it was legal yet. So I didn't have to like tell any teachers, no other students knew. So I kind of like solved my own problem there.
How old were you then?
I would say 17.
Okay.
Yeah, they just, you know, I went into, I remember I was in band, and I went into you know, the band camp day, and they were like, oh, look, you're gonna be my freshman. I was like, I'm a senior. And that was about the end of the conversation. You know, they honestly, I'm kind of shocked no one like questioned me. I came out to a friend like a year ago, and she had no idea. And I was like, really? We went to high school together. I was not medically transitioned. She was like, yeah, nobody knew. Like, kind of shocked me a little bit.
At what point did you learn about other trans people and the possibility of transitioning?
Um, I want to say it was about middle school. Since my dad wasn't very accepting, he threw me into therapy a bunch of times, and he'd take me out every time that they disagreed with him. Uh, so like there was one therapist who was probably the only one to pick up on like what was going on, and like addressed it with me, saying like, oh, there's these words like transgender, and you know, like out yeah, the person who referred to me being called a girl is like outing, and just things like that. I only saw her one visit because my dad didn't like it, but kind of like at that point I was like, oh, there are words for this, and I kind of like thought about it, and um, I didn't really like adopt it right away. Um, I just kind of like knew of it, and like when I saw references in like media and stuff, it kind of like would pop up, and I kind of learned about things that way. I was kind of a dumb, isolated kid, so I didn't like Google anything. I didn't like go like, "What's wrong with me?" on the internet. Uh, I just, I don't know. I was very much in like denial that I was like ever a girl or female, and I wanted to keep it that way. And calling myself trans kind of would have to like cement that in a way that like, oh, I was female, and so I think that was very difficult.
And then when you did make the choice, well, how long was it between that appointment with that therapist where she gave you that word, and then it sounds like you took that away and thought about that for a while, and then so how much time passed between that point and the point where you decided to actually seek medical interventions?
I want to say I was probably about 12 when I went into that therapy session. Um, and I didn't seek medical transition until about 19 because I physically couldn't because my dad would never like consented. He didn't want me to change my name or anything, but um, I also didn't really like know the process until I met like other people, and I really didn't meet any other trans people until I was about 18, 19, through other like friends, and then I learned about the medical process through that. But um, I think I kind of accepted the trans label maybe about 18. So it's probably about 6 years of kind of pushing it away after like hearing about it, just being like, no, like, I'm just a male and there must be something like physically wrong with me. And thinking like I remember it's stupid. I was a stupid cringy teen, and I would tell people like, oh, I tell potential girlfriends, I would tell them that I was just, you know, intersex. That's just how I describe it. I didn't feel comfortable saying like trans or anything. I very much avoided that. I didn't want to be, seen as female in any regard, and I feel like that was, kind of cementing that I was at least once female, and that I just couldn't latch onto that at the time.
Is
I
that
used to have
something?
that same hesitation where I felt like admitting or calling myself trans. I've far moved on from this, but back in the day, I viewed calling myself trans as basically admitting that I wasn't really a man, right? Like I was
Yeah.
acknowledging that I was female, and
Yes.
there was something that felt wrong about even accepting the word trans because it was admitting I wasn't what I thought I was. It's really convoluted, but yeah, difficult for people who haven't been down that to know what that what that weird
Yes.
mental process is, because it's definitely there.
Absolutely. That's exactly how I describe it. And like, through media, I had heard about like, not like in depth because I didn't like go searching for these things. I'd heard about like the concept of like sex changing, and I just like instantly was like, oh yeah, I'll do that. I didn't like go into any other detail. I was just like, yeah, I just kind of assumed that that would happen eventually. I didn't like learn about it or anything until I was maybe about 18 when I met other people that had gone through it, and I was like, wow, like, it's a real like process that you can do. And so I just did it, you know.
As far as the process that you went through, like, were you assessed, or what was that process like for you?
Yeah, so this was about 2014. So as far as I knew, that most people were getting assessed first, and all my friends had. So that's where I started. I didn't even find a doctor. I didn't find like surgeons or anything. I just had a bad habit of not Googling things, I guess. Uh, so the only thing they gave me was the name of their psychiatrist, so, or therapist. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, they gave me the name of the therapist, and so that's where I started. I just made an appointment with her, and she like gave me all these resources, like, oh, this is how you can change your name, and this is how you can get medical treatment. She did like a pretty thorough assessment, I would say. Like, looking back, I think that she did a really good job, and she explained why we needed this process. And she actually explained, because I was curious, like, oh, well, why can't I just go get hormones? Like, why can't I just go do that? And she explained how some people might believe that they're trans when they're not, or they have feelings of like distress that might cause them to want to transition when they shouldn't. I was like, oh, okay, I didn't know about that. Like, I didn't know people did that. And it only took me a couple sessions. She wrote my letter, and I got my medical care from there. And I've gone back to her for every letter I've had to get since. Like, I've never gone to informed consent. I just won't do that to myself.
Do you remember what kinds of things she covered in the assessment?
Yeah, so she covered people who grew up in really homophobic families, who might feel that the only out and the only way to be accepted is to transition, so they would be quote unquote straight. Um, that's obviously not a very good reason to medically transition. There was also, people with um, sexual trauma, physical abuse that was related to sexual characteristics. Um, there was other things like fetishes. I don't think she really covered that one a whole lot because I was still pretty young, and I think it would have been a little bit awkward. But she very much emphasized like the abuse history, and like the growing up in a homophobic environment. She gave me like some examples that she had seen, not by name or anything, but um, just sort of like how she would see like men come in who were abused for being, gay, and they're like, I need to fix this. I'm going to become a woman so that I can date men, because I clearly can't change my sexuality. So, I'm going to become a woman, and I'll be straight. My family will accept me, those kind of things. So it's very interesting that that's kind of coming up now, when she had told me about that before, like, yeah, 2014, almost 10 years ago now.
So it sounds like it was on her radar that there's different motivations for transitioning, and she had seen that in her practice.
Absolutely. I saw her again this last year to get my letter for hysterectomy, and we actually talked about it again. And she had mentioned that there was a lot of detransition, and she was seeing a lot of that, and that she felt that maybe the process that's happening with providing care is not very responsible today. And we really connected. I actually, she gave me her like personal phone number, and like we emailed for a while, and we just chatted on Zoom like this, because it was like during the height of COVID. And she told me that she was going to retire, and she gave me all of her books. She gave me um, every single like transgender conference books. Let's see, the I think they're the, oh God, there's so many. There's like 20 of them. Like, I think they're the W Path books, like with all the like studies in them, and the guidelines and stuff from like, I think they go back to like 1996 or something. Like, she gave me a ton of books, and um, you know, was very excited that I was very open to these ideas and kind of recognizing these things. So it made me feel pretty good. I'm really sad that she retired, because, and more people are gonna maybe go into informed consent or get improper evaluations. So just kind of mourning the loss of a sane voice, I guess.
I wonder if part of her motivation for retirement is that she can't do the assessments anymore. It seems to be the case that she's basically Aaron. You probably have more insight into this, but like essentially, if you're a gatekeeper, then there's no job for you anymore.
Hmm.
And so when you can't do it ethically, it's kind of like, yeah, you can't really keep practicing.
I kind of wonder that. I had thought about kind of asking, but I didn't feel like it was appropriate at the time to ask, like, oh, why are you retiring? Um, but I imagine, at least with the amount of like people seeking care today, that she was probably experiencing the influx of those kind of patients. But I mean, she also worked with like other kinds of patients too, and she was a little bit older, but I don't know, like maybe her mid 50s, so not really that like not like she's not practicing in her 70s or anything. So I do wonder if that has some sort of influence. Like she didn't want the ethical dilemma of turning people away every day.
It sounds like for you, the assessment process was okay and wasn't super uncomfortable for you. Did you find it helpful in any way?
I did find it helpful. Not only did I get a lot of resources from her that I didn't know about previously, like how to find a doctor and how to get on hormones, how to find surgeons, how to change your name. Like she had resources for everything. She had support groups. So I don't regret going, even though I didn't go to any of the support groups, but um, you know, like she was willing to talk about other things. I only saw her for a couple of visits. But I definitely I don't like not recommend. Well, I don't regret going at all. It's a good ease of mind that you have somebody who knows the medical field and people practicing, and they can get you into like good, responsible, and educated care. Like the doctor that she recommended me, I still see her, like 8 years later, and she's really great. And I know friends who never went and got evaluated, that never like spoke to a professional, and they went through doctor after doctor, just going through like terrible care and Planned Parenthood and like nightmare doctors. And I seem like the only one who's got like good care that I'm around. So it's I think it's pretty important to seek that vital resource, so if it is the right decision for you, you have more resources after that and you're better off for it. Like I don't really see a reason to ever like avoid it. It's not a painful process, and I got a lot out of it.
That's the part I find confusing about this push to eliminate that, that thorough assessment or any therapy beforehand is like, what are the demonstrated harms of an assessment process? Like no one has really been able to articulate that. I'm not aware of any studies about that where people were harmed by an assessment process or by going and seeing a counselor. I mean, are there people who aren't great counselors out there? Sure. Like so maybe they just had somebody that they didn't feel comfortable with or wasn't terribly skilled or said something that was hurtful. I mean, completely unrelated to trans stuff. I mean, all kinds of people have a negative experience with a therapist, but don't then turn around and say, well, all therapy is a bad idea and I discourage all people from going to a therapist. So I find it puzzling that despite the fact that there aren't any demonstrated harms or documented harms of an assessment process, that there's this push to eliminate it altogether as though it's somehow harmful and
Mm.
oppressive and offensive for us.
I see that a lot too. I one of my closest friends who's detransitioned now, I was there for the whole process of transitioning, and it was very like, I recommended my therapist at the time, the one who I saw for my letter, and they wouldn't go to it. I wasn't very like versed in like politics or trans ideology or anything. Like I didn't really know a whole lot of trans people. So I just kind of against my better judgment was like, okay, you lead your process and I will help you. So they wanted to avoid therapists at all costs, saying that they're like gatekeepers, and I didn't really know what that meant at the time. This is like, I want to say this is 2015. maybe 2016.
That seems to be exactly when the shift happened.
Yeah.
Was around 2015 with the massive boom. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, they avoided the care, and like they, you know, didn't really identify as non-binary yet. They definitely went in that direction quickly after starting hormones, and I helped them get on hormones. We went to a informed consent informed consent clinic. Like I drove them there. We went to the doctor's office together, and the doctor, of the informed consent clinic, she was like, I don't think this is right for you. I feel like you're maybe like a lesbian, or you're, this just isn't right for you. And, he got really upset. And I don't know what changed her mind, but she gave him his first shot that day, after, you know, saying that this isn't probably right for you. Still went ahead and did it. Um, but they were, my friend was so upset about being questioned, that they never went back to that clinic and just went to Planned Parenthood instead, and had a plethora of issues there, with that system, and ended up getting top surgery, unfortunately, um, and then detransition maybe, I want to say like 2 years ago. So there's maybe 4 years of identifying as trans, and then non-binary, and then is still kind of coming out of that. And they're also kind of considering speaking up about it, and you know making other people like know like what this experience is, and like, um, to seek therapy, because that was their main thing that they talked about, is how they wish they had just gone to the therapist like I suggested. And I remember them telling me that they thought that, I wouldn't think they were trans enough if they told me exactly how they felt about transitioning. That maybe they weren't wanting to grow facial hair, they weren't wanting to, have this or that change. They just wanted a deeper voice, and like to lose body fat, and they just didn't feel that anyone would think they were trans enough if they were, open about their feelings. And it's kind of a tragedy that that's the view that therapy has, that you can't be open with them because they're just gonna like slap you away. And like that's totally not true. They're gonna work with you. They're gonna, they're not gonna be like, oh, this isn't right for you, go away. They'd be like, maybe this isn't right for you right now. Let's explore this. They're gonna talk to you. They're gonna sit there. They're gonna do their job as a therapist. So it just kind of blows my mind that like that can even be a thought, that like, oh, these therapists are evil and they're just gonna like slap you across the face or something.
Yeah, there's such a distrust for care providers, and it really comes, I think, because I wonder if people, I think people pick that up from the culture, from the trans culture, because they hear so many people saying that, right? That, oh, you need, they're gatekeepers, and they're paternalistic, or whatever the community says, that really, I think, sort of cultivates this atmosphere of distrust for any care provider.
Mm.
Does your friend in hindsight wish that therapist had kind of gotten through and had not started?
Yeah, it wasn't even a therapist they saw. It was just the informed consent doctor, the one who prescribed them the hormones. And they wished they had gone to the therapist. Because I recommended my therapist because she was great, and I had all these resources, and but he they they're going by they now. They refused to kind of, um, I don't know, even be open to the idea of therapy, being like, I've been in therapy before, it wasn't helpful for me. They gave me this diagnosis, I didn't like that. And, they would just throw me in a mental hospital, and, um, just all these things that I was like, I've been a therapist before. I've never had that experience. And, it's just, they were very involved with the online spaces, and I wasn't. So I feel like if I had been involved in the online spaces, I would have like maybe known a little better that like where this is coming from. I was just, kind of blown away that this person was so adverse to every like suggestion that I thought was positive. And they, were a very negative person for a very long time. And, I think that they're finally, after having detransitioned for a while, kind of come around. And, I've started seeing some like positive changes. And, it's, I think they're seeming a lot healthier than they've ever been before. So I'm at least that's come out of this experience, even if it's not like ideal.
And now you're studying psychology.
Yeah, major psychology and a minor in biology. Um, so I feel like I've always been everyone's therapist. So I feel like it was kind of like, you know, destiny at this point, because, you know, I've always been the one to try to help all my friends. You know, I've helped several people like with their transitioning stuff, even if it's, you know, not worked out for everybody. And, you know, I don't typically do that anymore for, I think, good reason. But you know, people have always come to me, and you know, I've always taken an interest, especially in personality disorders. That's like my top thing that I want to study. I don't really know if I want to work with trans patients eventually. I want to maybe go into like clinical psychology is what I'm aiming for. I was going to be a psychiatrist, but a psychiatrist who I wanted to mentor me said it wasn't worth it, so I decided against that. I was like, "Would you do it again?" He said, "No, don't do it." I guess clinical psychology and maybe go into research. I keep being torn about whether or not I want to research more into like these experiences with gender dysphoria, or I'm not really sure, because you know, I just, part of me hopes that the trend just dies away and everyone goes back to normal, and but I'm like, I don't know if that will without, you know, research like substantiating other things other than the popular opinion. You know, I'd like to see research on, you know, different kinds of gender dysphoria, you know, because obviously there's not just one. People seem to think it's like a synonym for being trans, and it's not. Gender dysphoria is a symptom of being trans. It's not the entire experience. You know, you can be dysphoric and not trans. You know, I think we've seen a lot of those cases recently, and people seem to gloss over that for whatever reason.
What's called gender dysphoria has become really watered down. Like when I've used the word, and I'm trying to shift this because it causes confusion, but when I've used the word, I specifically mean that incongruence that some of us felt.
Mm.
And these days, I mean, when you take the word literally, you know, like dysphoria just means distress. So any gender distress now gets called gender dysphoria, and
Mm-hmm.
it's really muddied the waters, I think. I mean, just in terms of like different experiences, that not every distress with your body and not every distress with being your sex, it necessarily means that you have this experience of incongruence.
Mm-hmm. I think I think one of the hard things is also figuring out is this multiple kinds of gender dysphoria, or are there just a lot of mistaken cases of gender dysphoria? You know, like, are these people who are experiencing like, you know, the result of sexual trauma, like, is that a form of gender dysphoria to feel this disgust for their bodies, and, you know, to have this, you know, want to be the opposite sex for, you know, various reasons? Like, can that be considered a form of gender dysphoria? Because you only need two of the 7 or 8 criteria to be, you know, considered gender dysphoric. So it's really hard to say, like, you know, would this be considered the differential diagnosis, or is this, you know, would this also be considered gender dysphoria, or is this just, you know, a mistaken case? It kind of aligns, and, you know, it's not quite there. You know, I think this, it's too ambiguous, and I don't think that's helping anybody.
Yeah, the criteria is really vague,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like when I was training to do hormone readiness assessment, there wasn't a lot of training in that differential diagnosis piece. Like there's acknowledgement that we should be doing that, but not a lot of guidance about, well, what is that exactly? Like what other conditions could look like gender dysphoria, you know, like autism, for example. So I was really
Mm-hmm.
happy to see the new WPATH standards of care have more emphasis on the autism spectrum, and recommendations that clinicians who do the assessments have competency in you know, understanding autism, or make a referral to an autism specialist, to, you know, because there does seem to be so much overlap between autism symptoms and gender dysphoria.
I kind of wonder about autism too, because I've tried to look into these studies, and I think it's some of them that I've seen linked to me because I'm always asking questions. I mean, critical of, you know, things that people say with like, that are definitive. Um, you know, I'm starting to kind of wonder if a lot of these cases are also autism, or if this is another like thing that's just becoming really popular, like, the kind of a fad that people are getting like evaluated for these conditions, and kind of like, you know, sort of dramatizing some of the symptoms. I guess that's not maybe not quite what I mean, but um, I just kind of wonder about what these autism assessments are, because some of the studies have been like, um, like a short survey for autistic features, and associating that with, gender dysphoria or trans identity. And, so I kind of wonder like, what's your experience with those studies? Like, have you seen kind of like, are, are they sort of assessing like people who are actually diagnosed, or is it more symptomatic based?
The studies about that, the link between gender dysphoria and autism.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Um, I'm not, really deeply familiar. Like I know that I've read some of those studies, but it's been a while since I've read them. Showing the correlation. But yeah, it's not a topic that I know a lot about. I'd really like to have an autism specialist on our show at some point to really to talk about that and some of the correlations. I mean, I think there's a lot of speculation, like what is that correlation about, and so there's different ways of reading it. I mean, is it that, I mean, we do know, especially autistic girls do tend to have more kind of a more masculine presentation. I mean, I've got a study actually on my desktop that shows when they matched facial features of girls with autism that they showed more masculine features, masculine typical features, and some of the social patterns. I mean, Aaron and I have talked about this in other podcasts too. That sometimes, people with autism, they don't always pick up on social cues in the same way. They don't always. They're often more gender nonconforming for that reason. That they're just not as tuned into trying to conform to, socially to what they're seeing, and so I can understand like how the symptoms of autism could very easily be mistaken when you feel kind of that you're having trouble making social connections with people and bonding, and that your style of communicating or expressing yourself might be more male typical. Then there's other readings of that. I mean, so that one I completely understand and agree with. Another reading is the connection between autism and testosterone. That there's some wonder if testosterone exposure as a developing fetus, if does that have any impact on brain development in these and social features and physical features, and we do know that autism there is a link between autism and testosterone. So that's one potential reading of the correlation, and then you've got the Jack Turbins of the world who interpret that as like an acquired autism. That is, he says it's not necessarily a true autism, but you acquire certain social difficulties as a result of the gender dysphoria. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg sort of dilemma, right? That which comes first? Like, is this an organic autism, or is it? And that's how I always interpreted myself, which I'm rethinking now. But I always interpreted it as the gender dysphoria is primary, and because that caused so much discomfort socially, that I became avoidant of social interaction as I got older. And so I always thought, well, I've acquired some of these autistic appearing traits because they did seem to get worse and worse as I got older. I mean, as a little kid, I remember having lots of friends and I socialized fairly easily, and then it got more and more socially difficult as I got older. So I don't know. It's not necessarily one thing either. It could be multiple factors why we're seeing a correlation.
I was actually just watching a presentation today with a woman who specializes in autism, especially as it appears in girls and women, and typically it's identified in boys much younger. And then they're like, "Oh, in girls it only appears in teenagehood. Why is that?" And that's because social interaction becomes a lot more complicated for girls in teenagehood, whereas it doesn't for boys. It basically socialization pretty much stays the same, but in how social networks work between females become much more nuanced and complex and interpersonal and heightened, like highly empathetic, and people with autism spectrum traits have a really hard time adapting to that and can kind of feel completely like a foreigner amongst their own sex class. And just like Aaron was saying, I'm starting to realize, I'm wondering if I really what I've always called social dysphoria is much more a case of yeah, just that chicken and egg thing. Did I become socially awkward because I was really supposed to be a boy, or is my autism spectrum traits making me always made it very difficult to socialize and interact as if I were a girl. So I'm becoming really curious about that. I know there have been certainly a lot of studies connecting autism and gender dysphoria. And somebody we want to get on here, as Hakeem Maxwell. He's a psychologist out of the UK who did a lot of support groups with gender dysphoric, transition, detransition people, and the autism diagnoses were off the charts as far as the ratio of the people in those groups. And I think from his, it seemed like it was more so people who were previously diagnosed who were then coming to him for gender related issues. So again, I don't know from my memory, and this could be all wrong, but I think with those studies that you were mentioning, I think it's a case of the autism diagnosis was a concrete thing, and then they were exploring gender related issues. And I think now with the explosion of trans identification and transition, I think we're going to have to do that in a retrospect, like in the other direction. It's like, okay, we have all these trans people. Is there also an autistic trajectory that's here as well? So it could be that we 180 those things.
Yeah, I think part of why I do wonder is I'm also diagnosed with autism. It came a lot later. I think I was diagnosed, I was maybe 22. But I had had the symptoms for a while, and I got diagnosed, not really physically diagnosed with gender dysphoria, I guess, kind of officially, a lot younger. But I'd struggle with some of the issues of like the social awkwardness. And it does make you think back. I also had, I was very like extroverted and everybody's friend when I was like really young. And then about puberty, I'm sorry, my dog is whining. It I think about puberty, it became much more awkward. And I kind of fell behind socially. And I didn't really have a lot of friends. And then it became like clinging on to not probably the right friends. And but I've had my professionals who diagnosed me kind of like look at this and look at the interactions and stuff, which is another benefit of like going to get diagnosis and going to like see a therapist, is that you can kind of explore like how these things interact. And my main problem is like more like sensory stuff, like noise and excuse me, like noise and just like chaotic life like collapsing on me, I guess. I guess I kind of do wonder a little bit if like some of that like extreme bodily dysphoria like was also like impacted by this autism, because I just remember I'm sorry.
You're good.
I remember like just she's a puppy. I just remember like when I wear like my binder, or like I didn't really get a binder till later on, but I just remember like this intense feeling of like extreme discomfort and like wanting to like crawl out of my skin. And it's very much like kind of when I'm like just really overwhelmed, I kind of experience a similar feeling, and it's just like you just want to like tear your skin off kind of feeling. It's really unpleasant, but
In there. Yep.
Yeah, I remember that feeling.
yeah.
Well, to go on, just to riff off what you were just saying, is I've kind of come to again what I call physical dysphoria. As I was hyper fixated on my chest, it was just like so absolutely should not have been there, and I'm wondering, it's again, call it dysphoria. Is that's what I always understood dysphoria to primarily be, was just how wrong I felt certain aspects of my body were, and so um, and I'm realizing I think what a lot, and this is also brand new, so I could be totally inaccurate in this, but I'm starting to wonder if it was more like a sensory fixation that led me to that kind of obsessive, what I call dysphoria, was a more of a sensory obsession with how my body was and needing it to change. But why did it cause the relief? That's the curious thing, is like the sound of my voice doesn't shock me like it used to. Like having a flat chest feels so right. Like I don't continually seek changing my body now. So that's the part where, like, I no longer have physical sensory fixations on my own body. I'm obviously, like you were saying, like environmentally, I'm very, very sensitive to uh, and I used to just think I had social anxiety. That wasn't really social anxiety, but that was more environmentally triggered anxiety. But now I'm realizing, oh, it's sensory overload is what I'm experiencing, and I definitely experience that in my surroundings still. But I no longer feel that about my body like I used to. So I think that's kind of an interesting facet of all this.
Yeah, I feel like, all the, overwhelming sensations I've, felt in the past that also led to this. I had a prior diagnosis of a sensory integration dysfunction, which now is probably a misdiagnosis, because like they didn't even like test for autism because it wasn't like on their mind back in 2006 or whenever that was. But all those like feelings have kind of gotten a little better, I think, since transitioning. Maybe it's like not having to wear this like really restrictive clothing and having to be like super uncomfortable all the time. I think it just kind of like amplifies everything, and it's I'd like to know more about that interaction. I know that the clinic I went to, I guess more of like a research center that I went to get this diagnosis, they did explore like, how it might, affect the gender dysphoria and, all that. And they pretty much ruled that it, at least by their like regard, that it didn't have much like impact on me. Like I know that some of the reason that autism is a differential diagnosis because of, the tendency to like have sort of obsessive behavior over like maybe certain characters, or not being able to differentiate between like things you like and things you want to be and who you are, kind of things. But I didn't really have any of those interactions, so they kind of just said, oh, they might have like some side by side things of discomfort, but like they're two separate things. And I would like to know if there's more to that, like
Yeah.
I think there's definitely more to it.
Could be an interesting research field, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. We need someone to dig in and really research that, what
Especially
that
like
connection is, right? It's something I've become very curious about too, just because there is so much overlap, and I could totally see how, from what I do understand about autistic traits, it totally makes sense that could be experienced as a kind of gender dysphoria, and it's so hard to articulate to anybody else. We always stumble with over the words, and I mean, I think that's why we have these catchphrases like, "Well, I just felt like I was born in the wrong body," but some of those catchphrases have gotten us into more trouble than it's been worth, maybe, right? Because people have taken that a little bit too literally.
Literally, yeah.
But it's hard for anyone to understand why someone would voluntarily remove parts of their body. Like it sounds totally nuts, but when you experience it, it's almost like my mind had mapped a body that was different from my actual body, and the way my body had mapped that, it mapped it as a flat chest. So having anything on my chest felt like it was something that was just kind of stuck to my body that shouldn't be there.
Hmm.
Oh yeah. I didn't find like binders until a little bit later because they really weren't a thing when I first was like, buying them when I was like, I don't know. I used like sports bras for a long time. I would get like the very, very smallest ones I could possibly find. I was also I was very underweight for a long time. So like I'd be like extra smalls and just like, I'd wear like an undershirt on top of that so no one could see like the lines of it. So they couldn't tell I was wearing one. And, I feel like I was layering up so much, just like there was just so much discomfort. And, I tried like the Ace bandages and that was just hell on earth. I would never recommend that to anybody. Um, it's just like there's a lot of like reasons to be like really, have this discomfort. Like I used to be really uncomfortable about how my arms sat against my body because it like emphasized like curves. I'd always like walk like this, and I was very conscious of like how I took steps, and anything outside of that I just felt like really like vulnerable. Like if the wind was blowing and like clothing was sticking to me, I just like it automatically very overwhelming and just like sent me into like overdrive. And like I don't know, it's really hard to compare this experience to other like trans people because I didn't really know any others. I was pretty much the only one. I maybe knew like of another one, but we were never like friends, and so there's really nothing to compare. Like, hey, is this distress what you feel? Is this normal, or is this something else? Is this sensory thing, or what is it? So it's difficult. And um, I also kind of wonder if it's kind of unavoidable that we acknowledge there's a lot of kids nowadays that are saying they have autism, they're saying they're trans, they're saying this and that. So it's I think we're seeing a lot more of a correlation than maybe there necessarily is, um, because they're not like seeing therapists. They're very against that, so they won't go get diagnosed with anything. So I think it's a very complicated situation all around, seeing what the connections are here.
It's kind of a snowball effect too, right? I mean, if because there is this correlation between autism and gender dysphoria, the more trans-identified people you're seeing in these autism groups or forums, then the others with autism are going to be exposed to the ideology, and right. So it just kind of it's, and I'm seeing that in autism circles, people are saying that autism advocacy groups are becoming very queer theory based, and a lot of that ideology has crept in. And I've heard similar things in intersex communities and forums that there's a lot more people with intersex conditions are adopting the trans ideology and calling themselves non-binary. And though I think potentially maybe have, if anybody, have more the most legitimate reason to refer to a non-binary identity as maybe somebody with with a DSD. But yeah, so these ideas are just kind of they've fanned out and have taken over advocacy groups and organizations and other circles as well.
Yeah. And with my own career as well, I I often work with kids. I work in mental health facility, and I work with inpatient care. And I see a lot of kids. And uh, I would say maybe realistically 85% of them claim to be trans. um, Less of them claim to be autistic. Well, they're not reporting that. Um, we do have a few that are reporting like DID, a few that are reporting, being like having Tourette's or other sorts of conditions that are not diagnosed. And obviously, in a inpatient care facility, we are very strict about making sure that we're not putting anything as a diagnosis if it's only reported and there's no like record of it. Um, so I don't. It's really hard to say if that experience has made me feel more certain that these people are maybe like there's some sort of differential diagnosis that's appearing, or if they're like purposefully sort of misinterpreting.
It's interesting the ones that you brought
Yeah.
up, like the Tourette's tics and those those various things you just listed off are ones that psychotherapists all over the world are saying they're seeing more of that pop up in their practice of young people coming in saying demonstrating certain tics or OCD diagnosis. So there's a lot of concern, legitimate concern that kids are picking this up on social media like TikTok.
Mhm. I absolutely agree. I think, at least from my perspective, I work with kids and adults. Um, we don't see this with adults. It's maybe, I think in my time working there, I've seen maybe two or three that identified as trans, or that they were, claiming DID or whatever. People do come in, they're like, oh, I'm so OCD. Like, I don't really consider that part of it. But, with our paperwork and, with our staff, we only acknowledge pronouns in the kits for good reason, because it's about 85% of them claim to have different pronouns. They change throughout the day. They change day to day. They, change their gender and expression. Like, every single, time we get together as a group, we have to ask their pronouns because it's probably changed. We have to ask their name because it's probably changed. Like, when I first got hired on, the CEO came to us, our little new people table, came to us and said that was, like, he specifically mentioned that was something we're gonna have to deal with, is that, the kids will change their names and their pronouns every single day. And, I was like, already kind of aware that that's sort of a thing, but I, didn't really work with kids previously, so I kind of underestimated exactly the power of that statement, that they're going to change it every single day. Because it's, working there pretty much every single day, the kids will be asking for you to write their name differently on the board. And, between groups, they'll even change their, like, gender, and they'll, start ticking around each other. And, they'll have like pseudo seizures, and it's exhausting, I think, to work with the kids because of that. Like, again, we don't really see that with adults. Like, it's very occasional. They're usually like younger. They're like 18, 19. They usually cluster all these diagnoses together. They're clustering the OCD, they're clustering the DID, and then the Tourette's and the seizures, and all that. It's very obvious, when they're doing that, because they don't know the feature, like the atypical, like, features. Like, you don't see people having seizures and, like, gurgling on TV, which is a thing that people who have seizures always do, is they, gurgle. So it's like, and I it's bizarre to me that people can say, like, yes, these people are faking, we know this, and, here's why. But, like, being trans is something you don't touch. We don't talk about that at work. We don't talk about, people faking being trans. You talk about them faking seizures. Like, staff will go in the back room and be like, oh my God, this person, had a seizure, quote unquote, last night, freaked everyone out. And, but you don't talk about the pronouns. You don't talk about the changing gender. You don't talk about that as, like, some, like, fake diagnosis. Like, it's just something you don't say. It's like crossing a line. It's, I don't understand why this is the one condition that we make exceptions for all the time, like, clinically and, like, medically. Like, what other condition are you going to have where you don't have an evaluation first? If you have, if you're, like, having seizures, they're not just going to give you, medication and say, oh, it must be epilepsy, go on your way. Like, they're going to do scans, and they're going to, like, do a thorough examination to make sure it's not something else. I don't understand why this is the one thing we can't touch. Like, that's
Very
difficult.
effective activism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With your colleagues in there, do you get the impression that they actually believe that the trans thing is the real one? Oh, okay.
No.
They just all have to pretend as such.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I'm not out. I don't tell people that I'm trans. I don't. I never do. Like, half my friends don't know. that's a very like low key thing, and I think for good reason. I pass pretty well. I give a decent beard. I don't have like a strange voice. I'm pretty average height, I would say, shorter average. Um, but like, so I feel like I kind of live in a cis world, where I'm around people who, are talking as if there's no trans people around, and it's very like the vibe of it is very frustrated, um, exhausted, um, just sort of like that unspoken thing. Like there was a patient who came in recently who all piercings, and they had like something going on with their eyebrows, um that was like strange, and instantly like we're all like eyeing each other like, okay, we gotta ask the pronouns. So we went over, sure enough, they have the they them and all those pronouns, and so we pass along this information to our staff so that people are using the right ones with them. And the I don't know why I ended up with that duty, and every time I let someone know, there was just this huge sigh of just exhaustion, just like just like again. And I was passing it off to the next staff, and it's he's passing it off to the other person who's working. He's like, oh, this is what we're gonna have to deal with. And I was like, okay, that's the vibe here. Like it's sort of just like everyone's kind of tired of it. And that's with the adults too. Like the kids, I remember my first day working with the kids. um they showed me their pronoun list, and there's several crossed out because they're changing. um and it was kind of like a very low key thing of saying, like, because they don't know me, they're like, well, these things change all the time. Here's our policies about it. Here's what you tell them this, and here's why we do this, because you'll never know if someone will just correct you or someone will go into a meltdown. And it's just the things they were saying are very like, you know I don't think activists would be very happy to hear how people in the mental health field kind of actually feel when no one's listening. um, I'm sure a lot of these people probably post as allies all day, but in real life, it's I think the general gist is that people are kind of over it.
Mhm.
I'm over it.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's still lots of debate about, because it sounds like the three of us had a similar kind of dysphoria. I don't know if any two people ever experienced it exactly the same, but we all had this early childhood experience anyway. And I think there's still debate about even what that is. But that aside, I think one of the values that we have as trans people is to at least be able to say there's something different happening now with some of these kids, like that ROGD phenomenon that seems similar to like those tics that you're talking about, and the OCD and the DID and all these other diagnoses that these kids are picking up. There's this new phenomenon happening, and the clinicians are afraid. I think that lots of clinicians see it, but they're afraid to break the social contract that we have, right? We have a social contract as trans people in the world that people are going to use our pronouns and respect us in that way. But we have to be able to break some of those rules in order to identify this group of people and actually ask questions and investigate that and see that for what it is, right? That just the amount of dissonance that clinicians, I felt it, you probably felt it, that we feel where our clinical judgment is in conflict with these social rules that we're not supposed to ask certain questions of trans people, and so we're not able to provide safe, competent care.
It definitely affects other patients too. You know, I think people sort of see like online, they'll be interacting with somebody and it says like, oh, I'm 16 or whatever. And it's kind of still a very theoretical kind of like projection of what this person might be, depending on the person's, experience with like a 16-year-old. And I kind of felt like that was probably the case for me, is that, I'm like, oh yeah, this person's 16, like don't take them too seriously and whatever, and like, you still end up in an argument with them, and go down a rabbit hole there. But now that I've actually worked with these kids and I see them like all the time, I'm like, it kind of puts it into perspective, like who's that person behind the screen, and like what's really going on here. Because I would not ever trust any of these kids to give like an accurate like diagnosis to me. Like I would never take these kids seriously. I like it working with these kids, it blows my mind that there is ever a circumstance where someone can get medical care at that age, as the kind of people that they are, that they are not like, their judgment is not like accurate. Like I don't think that every single one is like faking it on purpose. I don't think that they're being necessarily disingenuous. I notice a lot of patterns with a lot of these kids that are changing up their pronouns, as there's a lot of like abuse in the home. There's a lot of like bullying and stuff. Like, I think that a lot of them are making genuine mistakes, that they're feeling really bad about themselves, and they're feeling bad about their bodies, and they're uncomfortable, and they don't know how to express that. So they latched onto this thing that they keep seeing over and over. They think, hey, this person is uncomfortable with themselves. That's my experience. I'm uncomfortable. And so they're latching onto this, and they're, I don't understand why there's no questioning that. Like, hey, like, why are you uncomfortable? There's none of that. It's just, oh, you're uncomfortable. You say you're trans, you say you're this. Let's just, clearly the way to solve this is to get you medical care. I cannot fathom that happening to any of the kids that I've seen and worked with. It's, it kind of blows my mind to like be put in perspective actually seeing it. It's like, I don't obviously want these kids to suffer with anything. I don't want them to be uncomfortable, but I don't think it's right that we just blindly accept what they say when we wouldn't accept anything else they say. It's like, I want the best for these kids. I want them to, have productive lives. And I just don't think that, we're doing them any justice by, just saying, okay, here you go. Let's explore what this distress is. And like, even if it is right for them that they're, they should transition and later in life, go on and they'll be happy. But like, I don't understand what's the problem with questioning it and like, making sure, so that this person doesn't go on and like, oh, was I sure? Was I even ready? Like, it's not just about like, oh, is this person right for it? Is this person ready for it? Is this person, going to benefit from it? Because the answer might be no. And, these kids, like, a lot of them have a lot of issues, and I just think they need better care, you know?
I've noticed this. It's almost like this culture where they, um, where you're only afforded empathy and care and support and attention and love based on a diagnosis. Like if you have a diagnosis to offer, it's like this is what I have, but
Mhm.
just your everyday like struggles and like the like these kids are obviously coming from terrible home environments. They've got whatever else going on that's just normal adolescence that people need love and support. It almost seems like the only avenue to attention and love and support and empathy and care is to provide a diagnosis or a system or a symptom pool. It's like this is the currency that I have to provide in exchange for love and attention and care, and it's very dark.
Like, yeah, lots of them, they're coming from this bad home life where they're probably not getting the attention. They're, a lot of them come from like foster care, and, a lot of them are coming from like single parent homes, or, homes where a lot their other family members have left in some manner or another. I think they're kind of like trying to search for that like identity, and that's a very critical period to do that, is searching for your identity. Like, I am definitely not the same person I thought I was when I was 16. I'm not even the same person I was at 21. So it's, I don't know, it's hard to describe. Like, um it's very bizarre coming from this experience of growing up knowing exactly like who I was, like in terms of like what sex I thought I was, or that I become somehow, and then like see these sort of like trivial pronouns being thrown around, and like, some people, I get the feeling, sort of associate that like, oh, that's the whole trans community, because that's all they ever see, especially, with the kids that I work with. Like, I don't think I've seen an actual, something that I recognize as like actually trans. I don't think I've seen someone like that come in. So, this is all their exposure, is just the pronouns and the weird other diagnoses that are going on, and like the bad home life. And, they're going to grow out of it because, we don't see them when they come in as adults and they're not doing the same thing. They've already grown out of it at that point. We have a lot of return patients, and, a lot of them come back in and they're completely someone else. So I think there's maybe sort of I think people aren't taking it quite as seriously as it is. They're like, oh, the kids are just playing around, but this is kind of the image that people have of what it means to be trans when this is all they see. And, that kind of sucks for like imagining like kids like that were in my, that are in my like, you know, um, kids that are in my place of like how I felt, and sort of comparing them to this, and like how like devastating that might be to, people who might be finding out their label, and maybe like trying not to adopt the trans label for the same reason that I did, like, oh no, this isn't me. And like, nowadays you'd see that label and see these people and they'd be like, no, that's definitely not me, and then they still don't know what's wrong with them, so like
Yeah, and
it's
what you were saying earlier about, are they faking it? And maybe the occasional one is kind of putting on airs, but I don't think most of them are faking it. And one of the things that it's being compared to, like with the, like sometimes I think it's very much sort of ideological, that they're picking up stuff online and it serves some internal purpose for them, but they're with the comparison with those, like the ticks and stuff that kids are picking up on TikTok and other places. They're comparing that to conversion disorder. I don't know how familiar you are and how much you've encountered conversion disorders. Whereby emotions are unconsciously converted into physical symptoms, and they're saying that some of these ROGD cases could be a kind of conversion disorder as well, which would be a very real experience. It's not like they're faking it. It happens at an unconscious level. But that's one of my curiosities, is how much of this new ROGD cohort is actually conversion disorders, which, is a very different treatment pathway.
I I think the problem is it's also hard to tell, and um, I think that's a huge problem because, if you can't tell if this person has these symptoms because of something else that's going on in their life or because of another condition, you know, I don't know how we can feel comfortable as a society providing kids medical care. Um, I definitely would not, say surgery is probably appropriate for these cases. Um, like I could see, in at least my opinion, I see hormones as being partially an option in late adolescence. I think it probably would have been a good option for me. I'm very cut and dry. Like, I didn't have any abuse history. I didn't, really have any like obvious differential diagnoses. I didn't have, personality disorders. Like, well, I mean, you can't diagnose a childhood anyways, but um, you know, I think too many of these cases are very ambiguous, and I don't think we can make like a singular ruling as far as, yes or no for medical care for these people. And, I it it concerns me that some of these people are getting medical care without evaluations, even as children. Um, that's kind of like, I don't know, like I could see the argument for adults saying that um, they can kind of make their own decisions. They can kind of, um, if they want to skip the therapist, and that's kind of their own fault. But I don't understand how that's happening to teens, especially with this experience that I've had seeing these teens in like really ambiguous like circumstances. Obviously, it's not ambiguous to me, but maybe to someone else who's trying to diagnose these kids, um, it might be a little ambiguous. They usually provide a diagnosis in the paperwork for like if they have depression or anxiety. And I think I've only seen a couple actual diagnoses for gender dysphoria before, and it was very obvious to me that it was, that person is definitely not trans. Maybe they do have dysphoria, but they'd be the kind of person who's maybe using she as a, female individual, and that's kind of really, it's very, very, it's pretty obvious that that's not probably gender dysphoria if you don't actually have the aversion to your sex. Um, I think it's really hard on doctors too. I don't envy the doctors that have to work with these kids. A lot of them are very old. Um, a lot of them aren't involved in the politics online, so they have no idea like what's going on out there. They're just, a lot of them, they mean well and they're just doing the best they can. And um, it's kind of a shame that they're not like, more aware of what's going on, so they can kind of realize that like there might be something else going on with this kid. Maybe not everyone who's reporting is reporting accurately. um, yeah, I think it's a very complicated situation, and I don't think that we can say for certain one way or the other whether care is appropriate for any age or any um, like kind of person. I would say even in my case as a kid, if I had gone in to receive medical care at like 16, even though I'm a very standard case, I think that it would have been very reckless to just go with that. Just out of like the immaturity of children, and um, the kind of wishy-washiness. Even though I was very certain internally, and I tried to express that as much as I could, that I was very certain that I knew who I was. um, I don't think we can expect any kind of clinician or outside body, any mental health system to recognize that and just assume that this case is accurate.
So what would you like to see happen in gender clinics? Like, it sounds like you're advocating for more assessment, or what do you think
I
needs to happen?
personally, I've never seen anything good come out of informed consent. um, I would not, again, it's just, my opinion. I would not say that informed consent is a good method to treat any person despite age with gender dysphoria, especially like clinics like Planned Parenthood are kind of dropping the ball. um, I would like mandatory, ugh, sorry, I would like mandatory evaluations, um, for some period of time. Like, um, I wouldn't say that has to be like a standard, like, oh, you have to be evaluated for like 2 years before you start anything. Like, I think it's very case to case. Like, I only required, I think 2 visits to get my initial letter for hormones. But again, I was pretty standard case. I didn't have any other conditions or anything. Um, I didn't have any concerns that any clinician could see, even with her, I think, very valuable and very thorough evaluation. Uh, but I think that especially clinicians who are less experienced should require a little more. I think there should be special training to recognize differential diagnoses, to recognize gender dysphoria in adults and children, um, recognize the other symptoms that are not necessarily considered dysphoria as well. I think that's kind of understated, that gender dysphoria is not a synonym for being trans of any kind. So obviously there's going to be other symptoms. There's other things that are going on that are very like characteristic of being trans, especially like transsexual. um, I I think that there should absolutely be a period of living as that sex before you transition. I know there's a lot of people who disagree with that, especially for trans women, who they're saying it's a danger to try to live and dress as a woman out in the world when you look like a man, or things like that. But I just think that hormones are not a magical cure for anything. They're not going to transition you overnight. um, so I think it's very important to be committed to that role, and to know that like you're in this whether or not you're attractive, or whether or not you're gonna pass. Like, that's not really the point of it. You're not going into transition saying, oh, this is only going to work if I look 100% like this. Like, you know, you understand there's a progress and you're going to feel better. So I think that living as your desired sex, um, having a thorough education um, through a therapist of maybe like kind of telling patients, like I was told about, you know, what might cause someone to think they're dysphoric or think that they're trans when they're not. Um, and I would predominantly get rid of informed consent clinics. There's just they're a mess, and they're overcrowded, and they don't have time for, you know, patients like they should to provide appropriate care. Like, you know, my friends that's now detransitioned, you know, they've been through the Planned Parenthood system, they've been through other informed clinics. They, you know, these clinics often don't even remember their name. They don't like recognize them. You know, they're seeing so many patients in a day that it's just like there's not even time to provide accurate care. There's not time to be thorough. And, you know, unfortunately, my friend ended up with cervical cancer, possibly related to the testosterone, but we're not really sure because, you know, it's, you know, there's not a whole lot of research on it, unfortunately. It probably would have been caught a lot earlier if it was not going through Planned Parenthood, you know, because their appointment system's really bad, and, you know, they're not very careful, you know. So I think there's a lot of dangers to that.
You would think that autism screening would be kind of standard too if someone doesn't already have a diagnosis, knowing that that correlation is so strong and well established that they would do an assessment for autism.
I would also argue an assessment for certain personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, which is what my friend had, well, has, you know, that probably led to them, you know, kind of lacking that sense of identity in their life, and, you know, the obviously history of abuse in that situation that may have led to feelings of dysphoria. Um, you know, I don't think that they are ready to like talk about it, so I won't go into too much detail on their behalf. But um, you know, just like abuse histories that might have to do with sexual characteristics, and um, you know, like the schizotypal personality disorder or schizotypal. I really hate that pronunciation. Uh, they, you know, also lack a sense of identity. Um, Maybe not necessarily a abuse history, but, you know, I think that sense of identity is very important. Um, Histrionic personality disorder, I think, needs to be evaluated. I know that's a very touchy subject. I know that a lot of people don't like to diagnose that or look for that because it's very stigmatizing. But I think that's very important because at least from what I'm seeing a lot of those features in a lot of the activists today, and a lot of the people who are claiming to be trans or dysphoric that maybe are not. Um, I think that, you know, personality disorders are obviously my interest, but I'm seeing a lot of those features with those three personality disorders that are kind of popping up everywhere. I seem to not be able to escape them at this point.
Yeah. I know when I went through the system, there was screening for all of that. I mean, it seemed to be much more thorough in its mental health screening. I had to, prior to surgery, I had to see a psychologist and did all kinds of screeners for personality disorders and different kinds of disorders. And I mean, if nothing else, it's peace of mind, you know, for myself, knowing that I don't have anything other than the gender dysphoria and you know, kind of garden variety depression and anxiety, which has been better over the years. But yeah, I don't know why they don't do all of that standardized screening anymore.
Yeah, I feel the same. I would have probably benefited from, as you said, my own peace of mind if I had had some a little bit more thorough evaluation for other like conditions. But, you know, obviously that's not why I saw the therapist. So, you know, I went to her for 2 sessions, and I felt like it was thorough, and I'm still very pleased with it. Um, but, you know, at the time I was questioning whether or not it was like dyslexic or something, because I had that diagnosis of sensory integration dysfunction. um, you know, it didn't feel quite right because it didn't like encompass all the symptoms that I was having. And I brought this up to her, but she was like, oh, well, we'll address that separately. And I never ended up going back to address that till very, very much later. but it would have been nice to like have an assessment for, my anxiety and depression, and maybe get treatment for those other things at the same time. I think that's very important to get care for those things early on. Like when I got screened for autism, they also screened other conditions, and I felt like this is a good evaluation. They, assessed like my IQ, they assessed anxiety and depression, dissociative symptoms. They assessed like, oh man, they performed so many tests on me. It was 6 days of like hours worth of testing. I couldn't even tell you anything that I got done at this point. But I literally tested in the 99.8th percentile for anxiety, and that would have been really easy. Like that would have been really nice to know earlier on, that was that severe. They asked me if I had ever been to prison because my anxiety levels. But I have not, by the way. It just, I don't know. I wouldn't say that everyone should just get evaluated for everything all the time. That's really a tedious thing to do, especially if you don't have like symptoms for something or, whatever. But like, I think in the process of, deciding whether or not someone should medically transition, and especially permanently, especially with surgery, I think that might be an important component. That's just, I think, one thing we have to just do, in order to get there. And like, I don't see how that's a big problem, because I remember when I was transitioning, like medically, I wasn't upset about having to wait for my appointment. I was just like, I was really excited. I was like, oh, we're taking another step. We're getting there. We're getting closer. And, I see people today, they argue with me saying that, having anybody wait and having to go get an evaluation and then wait for an appointment, like that is life-saving time. And, I never saw it that way. I saw it as like, I'm taking steps and it's really exciting and I'm going to get there. And, every step is another step towards, becoming more like how I feel like should be. So I don't get the whole aversion for, receiving care. I kind of see the same thing with people just talking about going to inpatient facilities or, even outpatient facilities, going to see doctors, going to see therapists. They don't want to do it because someone else they know had a bad experience, or because they had a bad previous experience, or, it's kind of a tragedy, because in that like denial of going to get these services, they're also kind of discouraging others from doing the same. And I'm very passionate. Oh, sorry, Ed.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, You're noticing that overlap between histrionic personality disorder and gender dysphoria. And I'm wondering how much those histrionics have influenced the culture around it in general,
I don't want to have a bias against like certain conditions, and I don't want to like participate in like, stigmatizing, because I understand these are a lot of things they can't control. But, it kind of, the histrionic personality kind of it irks me in that kind of way, where it's very domineering and very like follow the leader kind of attitude. It seems, at least when I'm picking up from it. So I think it's a big influence here, especially with those who are maybe being purposely disingenuous.
All good points.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming and chatting with us. It's been great to meet you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. I hope that was decent. Hope I wasn't too awkward or anything.
Not at all. You're great. This is a good conversation.
Yeah, great to hear your point of view. Yeah, you seem like a pretty grounded individual.
I hope so. I just, I feel like I have a lot to say and never enough time to say it. And, so I tend to talk a lot, and I apologize if that was the case.
That's the whole point of a podcast, is to get you talking.
I could talk for hours and hours about everything.
Well, I hope you'll keep in touch.
Yeah. Likewise.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.